Welcome to Module 3 of the ESCAP online learning course on BPA for Trade Facilitation. The objective of this module is firstly to propose a step-by-step project management concept as an approach to systematically manage and conduct a BPA project. Then, the very first step for starting any BPA project, so-called setting the scope, will be elaborated in this module. Some tips and techniques on how to define the BPA project scope will be articulated. So, let us start by discussing a systematic approach on how to conduct a BPA project. Firstly, it is recommended that BPA should be approached and managed as a project. This means that a basic project management concept shall be adopted for the successful implementation of the project. Here we propose a step-by-step approach splitting into three main phases for managing and conducting a business process analysis project. The three main phases are described as following. The first phase is called scope setting and planning. The objective of this phase is to specify a scope of business processes to be analyzed and also develop the plan to conduct this analysis. Again, we may notice that the scope of a BPA project could be very specific or could be very broad. For an example, a specific BPA project scope could cover the whole export processes of a specified product through the major mode of transportation normally used for that product. However, whatever the scope of interest could be, the scope should be precisely defined and as clear as possible. The second phase is data collection and process documentation. The purpose of this phase is to acquire information about the processes and their attributes, capture and document a sequence of steps in actual practices, and their attributes could include who involved or who are the stakeholders or actors participating in those business processes, procedures and documentations that are required as input to and output from each process, related laws, rules and regulations governing those business processes. Then, the third phase of this BPA project management is called process analysis and improvement recommendations. Within this phase, it is to analyze the as-is or existing business processes that we capture from phase number 2 and try to identify any bottlenecks or any redundancies in procedurals and documentary requirements. Examine what causes them, and also examine any quantitative indicators that we do collect, such as the number of steps, time, cost required to fulfill those business processes. And then we should be in a better position to propose the improvement recommendations that could reduce delays or eliminate any bottleneck, and also we should prioritize those improvement measures or improvement actions also. So there are 6 main steps within these 3 phases. Again, they are shown in this figure. So if we ask who are normally involved with a business process analysis project, notice that there are at least 4 actors involving within a BPA project. Firstly, the project sponsor or the project owner. This project owner is not just the individual or organization that has granted and supported resources for conducting this BPA project, but he or she should possess also an adequate high-level authority to take ownership of the BPA study outcome. With the right authority, the findings and improvement recommendations at the end of this BPA project should be formally considered, pushed, and escalated for actual implementation. Secondly, the project manager is the one who manages and controls the overall BPA project until its completion. Thirdly, the process analyst. This is the one who is in charge of business process capturing, modeling, and analysis. Fourthly, the business domain experts, or those individuals who are knowledgeable about the process under investigation. So, what should be the work products, or what should be the deliverables of the BPA project? The following table shows recommended work products or deliverables in all 6 steps of these 3 phases of the BPA project. For an example, in step number 1, which is about defining the BPA project scope, it is recommended that the work product or deliverable of this step is the use case diagram. This is because the scope of the BPA project could be visually and more precisely defined with a use case diagram, since the determining all key business processes and process actors could illustrate how large the process coverage would be. For other deliverables during the BPA project execution, they will be discussed further in more detail in the subsequent modules. So now we come to the second part of this module, which is about step number 1 of defining the scope of a BPA project, which will be discussed next. Some tips and techniques on how to precisely define the BPA project scope will be explored. The important tip is to determine the scope of a BPA project with more precision by drawing a use case diagram. This means that at least the following 3 important information need to be articulated and considered, namely actors or stakeholders, secondly, high-level or main business processes, and thirdly, relationships among those actors and main processes. So who should involve in defining this BPA project scope? To define the project scope, normally the project sponsor and the project manager need to discuss and agree on the scope with the support from business domain experts who are knowledgeable about the business domain of interest. Criteria and rationale for defining the BPA project scope are very much depending on at least the following criteria. Definitely the first one is the business domain of interest. The domain of interest could be just for a single organization. For example, the coverage could cover the procedures and document transactions required within a particular government department. Or the domain of interest could cover procedures conducted across several relevant organizations. For example, we might be interested in looking at the detailed joint inspection and customs clearance procedures conducted by custom officers and also representatives from other regulatory agencies. Again, the scope of the BPA project could cover several kinds of coverage. As we mentioned earlier, the coverage of the international supply chain under investigation could be very broad or very specific. For example, it could cover perhaps only buy, ship, or pay, or all 3 main of these business processes. In several cases, the coverage might be based upon the environment and conditions in which the business domain of interest operates, such as the specific mode of transportation, term of delivery, term of payment, the country of destination, or the country of origin, as few examples. The BPA's project scope could be dependent upon some strategic importance because of a public sentiment or public interest, or maybe depend upon our legislative priorities or some economic rationales. For example, within a country, you might be interested in looking at some strategic export product or perceived threats in the international trade to our country. So, for the tips of defining the BPA project scope are as following. The first one, we should be precise on the scope of the BPA project. By specifying the environment and conditions in which the business domain of interest operates at the early phase of the BPA project. Try to set the scope from the project beneficiary's perspective. This is very important. For example, with limited resources, a detailed modeling and analysis of business process for exporting one product may not be possible. In this case, the project may emphasize only upon the project beneficiary. For example, if the project beneficiary is an exporter, the emphasis may be about what the exporter has to do in order to ship the cargo to the country of destination. Or if the beneficiary is a carrier, the emphasis of our BPA project scope could be about what the carrier has to do or what the carrier can improve in order to leave the port of departure. In some certain cases, if the project scope is relatively large, we may break this big project into several small sub-projects. For example, if the project scope requires the analysis of business process for exporting up to 10 strategic products for the country, we may break this project into 10 sub-projects and define the project scope for each of them. So to be precise in defining the BPA project scope, it is recommended that we should develop a use case diagram. So based on the outcome of the initial desk research, we should try to identify key business processes and name each one of them with a descriptive verb phrase. We try to identify stakeholders and actors participating in those business processes, and also identify relationships between stakeholders and those key business processes. Let us look at another example of a BPA project scope. The use case diagram as shown provides a more precise scope of a BPA project since it captures all stakeholders and main procedures that involve in the scope of the analysis. Each and all of these use cases and actors must be further explored, captured, interviewed, and visited to obtain more detailed verification and validation. So in summary, this module introduced to you an overall step-by-step approach for managing a BPA project. And three main phases are proposed for systematically managing the BPA project. One of the very first steps of any BPA project is a scope setting. And we emphasize that some justifications on the selected scope of the business process analysis study must be articulated, proposed, and agreed by the project sponsor. For example, 1 or 2 strategic export products of the country, or 4 strategic import products, or for a major trade and transport corridor of the country could be some of the rationale for defining the scope of the BPA project. Or even some complicated procedures, something like custom clearance with some certain permits and or special inspection involving with several regulatory agencies can be a reason for BPA project scope setting. Developing a use case diagram is a way to be more precise about the BPA project scope, since it helps the BPA project team to concentrate on the basic information, including the list of all key stakeholders and all high-level business processes. So now, we reach the end of Module 3. In the next step, after the project scope concluded, the planning step will be discussed in the following module. So thank you for your kind attention. Have a good day and hope to see you again in the next module.